Well, good morning, all, and happy Mother's Day again. Russ and Lynn are out in the Caribbean, and Tom managed to make Russ afraid of icebergs. So I assured Russ that there were no icebergs in the Caribbean, and he said, not yet. So that's his positive attitude. Anyway, it's Mother's Day. And in preparing this message, I ran across this thing in Proverbs written by King Solomon, supposed to be the wisest king of Israel. And I thought that until I found out he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he was a fairly busy guy, but he had time to write this about the noble wife. And I'm sure your mothers have all experienced this on a daily basis. Her children will arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. So that's what King Solomon has to say about mothers. And like I said, I'm sure that you all are experiencing that on a daily basis. Your children arise and call you blessed. But the story I want to talk about today, I want to talk about two stories about mothers. And to start off with, Pastor Russ and I were in the prison together, and he just asked me, he said, are you going to be around on Mother's Day? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you mind preaching for me? And I said, okay, I should be able to find a topic pretty easy. And he said, well, you can talk about salt and light too. And then later on I was talking to Tom about it, and I figured with 6 weeks, 2 sermons apiece, I think he'd pretty much taken all the salt out of salt and light. 12 sermons on 3 words. But then as I was putting this together, I realized that he missed a spot. And he missed a spot about passing the salt. And that's what mothers do. Mothers pass the salt and the light to the next generation, just like the guys were talking on the video. And so I got a couple of stories here to talk about in the Bible. And one of them I know most of you are very familiar with, this story of Moses and his mother. And a little background here. They were in Egypt. The Israelites were in Egypt. And the first Pharaoh they were under liked them and treated them well, and they were really, everything was great. But then they had a new Pharaoh, and the new Pharaoh didn't know Joseph, and he said, these Israelites are multiplying too fast, there's too many of them. I'm afraid if there's an uprising, they're going to beat us all up and take our land. So he decided to get rid of some of them. And one of his methods was he made an edict that every Hebrew male baby born would be thrown in the river. Nice guy, huh? So that's the situation that these people are under when my story starts here. And this is Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to read verse 1 through 4 first. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now I'm going to stop right there for a minute. Imagine, if you will, a little domestic scene in Egypt around 3,500 years ago. And Moses' father was named was Amram. His mother was Jochebed. And they were being persecuted by the Egyptians. And they're worried about this little baby. They've had him for 3 months. They're hiding him. And one day, Amram comes home from pulling a double shift at the brick factory. And he kicks off his sandals, and he goes, honey, I'm home. And Jochebed goes, oh, here, honey, have some sweet tea. I got an idea. He goes, what's that? And he goes, well, I got an idea how to save our baby. And he said, well, that's great, because it's really been bothering the underworld out of me for the last couple of months here. So what's your plan? And she says, well, I'm going to make a basket out of these weeds. And he goes, okay, I follow you. And I'm going to smear around with tar and pitch and stuff. And a little strange, but okay. And then I'm going to put the baby in it and put it in the river and hope an Egyptian princess picks him up and adopts him. No, wait a minute. That's your plan? That sounds like a pretty weird plan to me. And it is. It's a very strange plan. They're doing this to keep the baby from getting thrown in the river, so they're going to put him in the river. Anyway, so as I was studying this, and I was reading and looking at some videos and what you do, and I found a hint that this was not Jochebed's idea. This wasn't Amram's idea. This was God's idea. And a little hint comes from Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, which is called the Hall of Faith, where he talks about by the faith of Abraham, the faith of Noah, the faith of all these people. And he says, by faith of Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they are not afraid of the king's edict. So it was by faith. Well, how did they get faith? They're basically, being held captive in Egypt. And where does the faith come from? But then Paul tells us in Romans 10:17, that faith comes from hearing. And, okay, so faith comes from hearing. Where did they get that faith? My theory is God talked to them. Now, the Bible has everything we need for our salvation, but it doesn't have everything that ever happened. It couldn't. So I'm guessing that God talked to Jochebed and Amram and gave them his plan. And by faith, they pulled it out. Because there'd be no other way they would do this. They would put their baby in a basket all tired up and throw it in the river. So it was by faith. And then there's another quote here that always struck me as odd. And it's in 1 Corinthians 1:25. It says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. That term, the foolishness of God, kind of got me wondering, does God ever do anything foolish? He's God. He knows everything. Well, what it turns out to be is what looks like foolish to us is what God does. That's wiser than man's wisdom. Foolish things like when he tells Abram to leave your family and start walking this way until I tell you to stop. That's a weird thing to say, but he does it by faith, and he's in the Hall of Faith. And when he tells Noah to build an ark because it's going to rain. What's rain? It sounded foolish. And as he built the ark, everybody told him he's a fool until it started to rain. So this is the foolishness of God. And he does this on purpose. He does this to get our attention. So they ended up doing this. They ended up taking this crazy plan, and it turns out that it really wasn't a crazy plan of a desperate mother. It was a divine plan of a sovereign God. And if you were to ask somebody, what are the odds if we took this baby, put him in the river, that the princess would find him, Pharaoh's daughter, the odds would be pretty slim. But with God telling him to do it, the odds are about 100%. It's going to happen, and it did happen. So here's the rest of that story, this part of the story, from verse 5 through wherever I quit. Then the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, that's Moses' sister, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So not only did this really strange plan work, but Jochebed got to be able to nurse the baby and get paid for it. So God does these kind of things. And I think he thought, I got plans for this baby. And he did. I got big plans, but he's got to go through some stuff first. And I'm going to save him from the Pharaoh, and I'm going to save him in such a way that people will be talking about it for 3,500 years, and we are. And that's why he does these foolish things, to get our attention. If he was just born and grew up and, we wouldn't even think about it. But almost everybody knows about the baby in the basket in the river. And I almost hate to say this, but this is the first time, the first woman who is an investment broker, she went down to the bank and pulled out a little profit. Just saying. Sorry. But God had something for him to do, and so he made it happen. And that's what he does. We always hear the phrase, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Well, he does. And a lot of times he does it just to get our attention. And if you want to know more about it, read the book of Exodus. It's very interesting. Or you can watch the movie, which is kind of old, but it's really pretty good. It has some neat special effects for the time. But the next mother I want you to talk about is one Tom mentioned, and he stole my sermon, so we can all go home. Yeah, you wish. This is a story, it's a love story, but it starts with tragedy, it has love, it has romance, and it has redemption. It's a very short story, it's 4 chapters. And 3 people, after I spoke at the first service, came up to me and said, the book of Ruth is my favorite book of the Bible. But a lot of people don't even know anything about it. Like I said, it's 4 chapters, very short, and on its surface, it's really an interesting story. But it's got layers and layers and layers of, a lot of the Hebrews, when they put their Bible together, put this book in with the prophets. It's a book of prophecy, as well as just a love story. But the background is, this is in the time of the judges. And the judges didn't do very well. The Israelites wanted people to run them, they wanted a leader that wasn't God. God said, I'm your leader. They said, no. So they had the judges, and then later on they had the kings, and the judges didn't work out very well. And there was a famine in the land. And the famines in the land were usually caused because God was mad at Israel. And there's this guy named Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi, and they had 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion, and they were starving. So they decided to move to Moab, which is about 75 miles east of Bethlehem. And so they moved there and lived with the Moabites. Now the Moabites were a little different. Moab was the son of Lot, based on an inappropriate relationship that I'm not going to talk about today, but if you want more, just go to Genesis 19. You can read the gory details. That's one of the R sections, rated R sections of the Bible. And I was talking to Tom. He said, that's a good way to get a lot of kids to read the Bible, is tell them it's R-rated. They'll be into it. So anyway, the Moabites were looked down upon by the Israelites. They didn't worship God. They had their own gods. They were just not nice people. But they had food, so they went there. And they were there for about 10 years, during which time the 2 sons got married. One married a girl named Orpah, and the other married a girl named Ruth. And then the father and both sons died. It doesn't say anything in here about why they died, but they died. And so then we had just the mother, Naomi, and the 2 daughters-in-law. And normal relationships between mothers and daughters-in-law isn't always the best. But in this case, it was very different, because Naomi was a special kind of mother, as Tom mentioned. And she found out that the food was back in Israel, so she decided to go back because she was really a total stranger in Moab. She was still a Jewish, worshiping God. So she decided to go back. She told the 2 daughters-in-law, you guys stay here because you're young, you're pretty, you can be married, you can have babies, And in Israel, nobody's going to want you because you're a Moabite. And at first they both said, no, we'll go with you. But then she talked Orpah into going back. And it's interesting. She said, Naomi said, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go with her. Gods, it's plural with a small g. But then Ruth replied, and this reply always gets me. And it's a beautiful song. Boy, that's bad. And Gail actually sang the song at the a cappella at Cindy and Steve's wedding celebration. But here's your reply. This is Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and forward. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Feeling like Tom up here. So anyway, that's quite a statement. I will die with you. I will go with you. I will live with you. Your God will be my God. It's a 7-part statement. And oddly enough, there are 7-part statements in the Old Testament. But anyway, just a little side note there. So this is a very strong relationship. And it ended up, again, a strange thing for God to have done, to take this Moabite girl and send her into Bethlehem. And all kinds of strange things happen. And read the book. It's really interesting. But in the end, as Tom mentioned, Ruth had a son with Boaz, who turned out to be the grandfather of King David. And Ruth is actually listed in the book of Matthew in the first chapter on the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So we got a Moabite woman listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ because God had a plan. Had a plan for a mother and a daughter who then became a mother. Now, to finish up here, I've heard many times that Christianity is one generation from going extinct. And if you think about it, that's true. If one generation just stopped believing, then it'd be over. But I don't think that's going to happen because God told us it wouldn't. The gates of hell will not prevail. But that's part of God's plan. And God doesn't need our help, but he demands our participation. So we need to pass the salt and the light. And mothers are the ones that teach you to say please and thank you. And that's part of it. So we just have to participate in this, and we have to make sure that we pass the salt, all of us. And I'd like to end with this little comment that Russ keeps making. He's done it a couple of times he's said it. There's 2 different statements, but I don't think he's ever tied them all together. But we win. Remember? We win in the end. And if it doesn't feel like we're winning, it's not the end. But that's the end. Thank you.